Hey everybody, it's me, Master Fija, and I'm back for what is now the third episode of Final Fantasy What? And today I decided to do things a little bit differently, almost kind of like a little Final Fantasy episode on the go. And today's topic is actually a pretty cool one. I've decided to do an episode on what is the worst Final Fantasy release thus far. Now, considering the fact that we all know that there's been quite a few terrible releases of this game genre, it was kind of hard, but I dwindled it down to 3. And you're probably wondering, well, Master Fija, how'd you get it down to only 3? Well, it was kind of hard. You're also probably wondering, was Dirge of Cerberus part of that horrible group? Nope. What about that horrid Final Fantasy XI Online? Not even. Worse. What about that really, really bad Final Fantasy XII spin-off, Revenant Wings? You're getting closer, but unfortunately, I think that the ones that I've dwindled it down to are probably the worst, not worst games ever made, the worst Final Fantasy. And here they are. As the first game released of Final Fantasy on the PlayStation 2 platform, Final Fantasy X was a fantastic game with great 3D playability, fantastic characters and character development, and the first Final Fantasy game to have a full cast of characters voice acted for the duration of the whole game. Now, unfortunately, like many great things, it bore a bastard child. Now, this bastard is what we know as Final Fantasy X-2, and was the only Final Fantasy game to bear a sequel, a direct sequel, in the entire series. Now, aside from this thing having pretty much a Britney Spears concert as the intro to the game, there's one good thing I can say about it, and that's that it has the first great customizable job system since Final Fantasy V. And that's about all I can say about it. Apparently it got pretty good reviews from critics now that I did some research. And, yeah, that's pretty much everything. I'll let you guys decide what you think. The second release that made my top 3 worst Final Fantasy releases is, of course, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. And this specific copy is for the GameCube. It was released back in Japan in 2003. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of Final Fantasy fans would agree with me that it is a horrible game, and just in the sense that it really kind of turned Final Fantasy into a very childish game genre. And that's totally not true, just because past Final Fantasy games have dealt with such mature things as murder, love affairs, deception, war crimes, and even, in some cases, prostitution and, like, global terrorism. Well, I don't know. The funny thing is that I would have thought that with most of the Final Fantasy fans being sensible people, and people knowing just in general when a horrible game like this comes along, they would kind of stop buying them and new releases would stop coming out for the Bloody series. But it seems that this thing just can't be put down. It's had so many sequels it makes me sick. Sequels like the freaking Rings of Fate and Echoes of Time, and My Life as a King, and My Life as a Dark Lord. There's just so many of them. And there's a new one that's been released for the freaking Wii. I don't even know its name. Of course, other than the original, which I was kind of tricked into buying anyway, I don't own any of the other sequels, and I really hope neither do you. Now, the last release that I'm going to cover isn't necessarily a game per se like I first said, but it was so terrible that I had to include it. Of course, I'm talking about Square Enix film Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Now, anyone who's ever played a Final Fantasy game or knows anything about the series would know that this is a horrible film and something that should be stayed far away from, except for this review, of course. Now, this movie was released by Square Entertainment Films in the year 2001, and costed around $137 million to produce. only of which $85 million it made back in box office sales. It was very much responsible for the demise of that specific part of Square, and was considered a complete and total utter box office bomb. So you may wonder where all of this leaves us. And I'd have to say on this kind of funny little grading system that I made up. Now, Final Fantasy X-2 gets 2 creepy yellow dancers out of 10. And Final Fantasy The Spirits Within gets 1 dead pop star idol out of 10. Finally, Final Fantasy The Crystal Chronicles gets the Viking of Disapproval, just because it sucks epically that way. Now, that's my final verdict on these 3 releases being the worst Final Fantasy releases of all time. Now, I'd like you guys to use the comment bars below and leave comments as to what you guys think is the worst Final Fantasy release of all time, whether it be something mentioned in this video or something that I haven't even really touched upon, like possibly this, or even this, or God help us, especially this. Now, on top of that, I'd like you guys to go down, leave comments, subscribe, rate, and leave tips as to future questions I could use for this series. And that's the end of the episode. Thanks, everybody. Peach out.